Typical examination of the cardiovascular system. Pulse character. If the pulse is recorded with a device that measures the rise and fall that can be felt with a finger, and the rise and fall is displayed on a moving paper or an oscilloscope, a waveform will be produced. The shape of this waveform is what is meant by pulse character. So examples of pulse characters are pulses, bisference, pulses, alternans, collapsing pulse, pulses, paradoxus, and even plateau pulse or normal pulse. So the waveform of the normal pulse is made up of a rapid upstroke, a very brief plateau, and a less deep downstroke. The downstroke is interrupted by a dichrotic notch which coincides with closure of the aortic valve, but the notch seldom is appreciated clinically. In aortic valve stenosis, the upstroke of the pulse is slow and the plateau prolonged. The plateau pulse is characteristic of significant stenosis. The normal blood pressure in an artery reaches a peak of about 120 millimeters mercury and a minimum of about 80 millimeters mercury. The pulse pressure is therefore 120 minus 80, which is 40 millimeters mercury, and it is a difference that can be felt in the pulse. It is not possible to judge any absolute figure with narrow pulse pressure. Let's say 110 minus 90, which is equal to 20 millimeters mercury, which is typical of a plateau pulse. If the pulse pressure is wide, a downstroke of the waveform is deep and the pulse seems to drop rapidly. This is called collapsing pulse. In aortic valve incompetence, the diastolic arterial pressure begins to approach the diastolic pressure in the left ventricle, which is usually only 5 to 0 or 5 minus 0 millimeters mercury. Typical blood pressure in a patient with a collapsing pulse of aortic incompetence might therefore be 150 millimeters mercury, and the pulse pressure that's being 100 millimeters mercury. To test for the character of a pulse, one raises the whole of the patient's right upper limb up and places one's palm on the middle of the right forearm. Then one feels how the pulse wave hits one's palm and runs away. In collapsing pulse, the pulse hits one's palm and rapidly runs away. There are several causes of collapsing pulse, and this includes atrial septal defects, ventricular septal defects, atriovenous malformations, aneurysms, fever, hyperdynamic circulation, even exercise, pregnancy, aortic incompetence, and thyrotoxicosis.